Wallace emerges from his car as the winner here at Bristol.
Some kids want to join the family business. Rusty Wallace? Yeah, right. How badly did Wallace, the son of a vacuum repairman, want to avoid working on those machines and instead focus on things that went fast and didn't suck? Well, let's put it this way. One of his former crew chiefs told me that he believes Rusty would take his preferred springs from their Martinsville cars after the race, and he'd keep them under his bed and not return them to the shop until the next Martinsville race because he didn't want them used or damaged at any other track. That was the car guy in him. Now let me tell you a story that tells you everything you need to know about his mojo. Roger Penske at one point early in their NASCAR program wanted to divest himself of the operation. He wanted to sell his portion to Wallace and business associate Don Miller, his partners in the team, but Wallace would have nothing of it. And he stood up to Penske, who even at age 55 in 1992 had solidified his name as a formidable businessman who loved to race but didn't like to lose.
I said, do me a favor, don't spin out on me now. That was the term I used. I said, don't spin out on me.
Roger Penske entered car that Rusty Wallace is driving, and there you see Rusty going down the front stretch there.
Wallace convinced Penske to stay involved, and the motorsports icon has remained in NASCAR long since Wallace left the driver's seat for the TV booth after the 2005 season. It's been nearly 20 years since anyone has seen Rusty Wallace race a Cup car. They've heard him talk as a commentator on television and radio. They have seen the various Miller cars he has driven. But I'm here to tell you things you kids don't know beyond Wallace's 55 career victories, including the 37 races he won with Penske, but never a championship with Penske, leaving Wallace with one title in his career when driving for Raymond Beadle. What you kids don't know, what people couldn't see, was inside Wallace's head. Some would call it cocky and others would call it confidence. Whatever you want to call it, he needed to dig deep into all he had to continue that Penske relationship.
I knew I could drive that car, and I knew he's the best owner, and I know we could have changed to the small amount of things he wanted changed to operate like he'd like to operate. And the other thing was, again, I'm not patting myself in the back, but I had a lot of good offers that I passed on to start a team with Roger. I didn't want to go just 1 year and then get rid of it because we had a disagreement. I had to convince him that don't do that, but it was just so easy. I looked at him and said, what? What are you talking about? I said, look, man, don't spin out on me now.
How did Wallace get so determined? How did he become the breakthrough driver from the Midwestern to NASCAR? I tell you that confidence made the difference. And I know what you're thinking. Yeah, all drivers lose confidence. And I'm here to tell you there was one and only one Rusty Wallace.
This is absolutely a compliment. Rusty raced with a lot of ego. And when Rusty did not believe that anybody should be beating him, he was hard to pass. When you got beside him, he wasn't going to let you go.
So how did he get that way? You can trace it to his roots. Wallace raced against the Midwestern stars such as Larry Phillips. He saw Mark Martin win American Speed Association titles and make it to NASCAR, and at the time really only have limited success. But Wallace saw that as his path, and he parlayed a 1983 ASA title into full-time Cup racing. In the racing world of unpredictability, it went just how Wallace drew it up. Seriously.
I was like an outlaw. I was running all over the country, just soaking up all this information. But I really wasn't doing anything to give myself a big name, except everybody knew Rusty. I said, I got to go after a title. And I went after the title in 1983 with ASA and won the championship. And the very next thing happened, I get a phone call from Cliff Stewart and Gatorade to drive in the Cup Series, and that's where it all started.
Wallace later connected with Raymond Beadle in 1986 and won a Cup title with him in 1989. This program didn't have all the money in the world, partly because Wallace demanded the team buy certain parts and pieces. They even got some help from rival Rick Hendrick to stay afloat. Wallace then circled back to Penske, whom he had done a couple of races for in 1980 before Penske felt Wallace needed more experience. Penske now maybe felt in a better place to start a full-time NASCAR team, and they partnered starting in 1991. It didn't go as well as they had hoped, and early in 1992, Penske wondered if he had made a mistake getting into NASCAR full-time. Wallace wouldn't let Roger Penske quit. And what allowed him to tell Roger Penske what to do? His brother Kenny could explain.
And if anybody's gonna talk to Roger Penske, I can see it being Rusty, because Rusty's sure of himself, and Rusty's told me plenty of stories. He would go at it with Roger to get what he wanted, because Rusty knows what he wants. He's very sure of himself, and that's why everybody always rallied behind Rusty.
Wallace carried that confidence because he would never get to Cup racing without it. He had to know as much as possible about the car, and so he knew what his car needed. That ASA racing in the Midwest, it forced him to learn.
The American Speed Association made me what I was. Myself, Mark Martin, and all these different guys, we had to work on our cars, so that's the reason I was always involved in the chassis and the shocks and building engines and, driving a car to the track, all this stuff. It's pretty simple. Back then you had to do it, so you had to figure it out.
Kenny could see it firsthand. He used to work on Rusty's crew.
He basically had crew chiefs just to tell him when to pit. Rusty Wallace chassied his race cars that took him to all of his wins. I mean, he knew his shocks. He knew everything about that race car.
But Wallace's knowledge went beyond just about the car. That vacuum repairman lineage in him, that salesman and work ethic in him, it carried into racing.
The ASA days, when they taught us so much that we had to know this stuff and we had to survive. My dad and my mom weren't giving me any money at all. They gave me support, but I had to learn this stuff and do it, had to find the sponsors, had to understand the cars, had to do what it took to make it happen. So that made me very, very determined right there. And I had a good path going and nobody was going to take it away from me.
Wallace knew he had to keep sponsorship, and Dale Earnhardt Jr. learned that the hard way early in his career. Earnhardt drove for Budweiser, ironically based in Wallace's hometown of St. Louis. But Wallace drove the Miller cars. It created a beer war from the day Earnhardt entered the series. The problem? Earnhardt knew nothing about it.
I remember my very first race at Atlanta, 1999. I was running Atlanta. I had a 5-race schedule, and I'm running like 15th or 14th, and I don't even know really about the beer car competition. It's Rusty Wallace. I mean, I've known Rusty as a kid my whole life, and I'm not thinking about how we're competitive as beer brands. And I'm driving, and I get underneath him, and we went down in the corner, and he got on my door and turned me sideways, and holy moly, I about wrecked. And he knew exactly what he was doing. And it was kind of like a, hey, welcome to the Cup Series moment for me.
If Earnhardt sounds surprised, he has good reason for it. The Rusty Wallace he knew outside the car didn't necessarily match the Rusty Wallace he saw inside the car. Those who had driven against him for decades knew that. They could see it, but only when they raced against him.
You can't see what Rusty has. You can't see that intensity. You can't see that heart. You don't see it in any driver until they get in a car. Rusty was determined that he was going to be somebody. Rusty was determined that he was going to be a Cup driver. That when he put that helmet on and started popping those wrists in the car, when you see that in-car camera and he's driving like this and popping his wrist and doing his stuff, he was so freaking focused on being the best race car driver he could be. That's what made him Rusty Wallace.
That Rusty Wallace finished in the top 5 in points 7 times. He finished top 10 in points 16 times over a 17-year stretch. Think about that. From 1986 to 2002, he finished top 10 in points during a period where the sport might have had its deepest and strongest fields as far as cars and drivers. They didn't have playoffs back then. It all came down to running well consistently throughout a year. That success didn't surprise those who knew Wallace the best.
When I changed Rusty's tires, I knew we were going to Victory Lane. And it was easier to take a butt chewing from Rusty, because if you just did what Rusty told you to do, most likely we were going to win.
The short tracks proved his bread and butter. He won 9 times at Bristol, 7 times at Martinsville, 6 times at Richmond, and 5 times at Rockingham. But he also won 5 times at one of the biggest and fastest tracks on the circuit at Michigan.
I feel like he could have been the crew chief and the driver, and just the way that he liked, to be a part of the race team, not just as a driver, but working on the cars, creating the setups, understanding what the car needs, and not actually being able to put that into the car with a spring or a shock or pitch or weight, whatever it may be. So yeah, it was any time, and it really played out on the short tracks especially, because I think, again, that was his background, but he had incredible knowledge, and I was always envious of that.
I don't know if I'm envious of his knowledge. I'm still really envious of the fact he got Penske to change his mind. Granted, he did it decades ago, but it takes a heck of a salesman to do that. Maybe he worried he wouldn't pave the way for other great Midwestern drivers such as Alan Kulwicki to get to NASCAR. Or maybe he worried he'd given up his life as a successful potential vacuum repairman to achieve a lifelong goal of racing against the NASCAR elite for decades. Or maybe he worried that because driving a race car was his greatest talent, that if he couldn't make it in NASCAR, he wouldn't even know how to make ends meet. He certainly couldn't envision failure as an option. He just had to convince Roger Penske of that.
But I learned a lot from Roger, and he wanted a certain level of professionalism. And I don't know if I was able to even understand how to do that back in the early 90s, but he taught us, and I talked him into not spinning out.
Hey race fans, thanks for watching our video. For all NASCAR on Fox News content and the best clips from Fox Sports, be sure to follow and subscribe to our channel.